Warm greetings, dear ones, and welcome to worship at Unity Church. Welcome to this time we set aside each week to help us find and keep our balance, to think about those things that matter most, to root out racism in ourselves and in the world, and to align our lives to integrity, service, and joy. As we reach out from the sanctuary, we too miss being together in person. Despite the limitations, we hope you can enter in as fully as you are able. Light a chalice, speak and sing along, call out the names of those in need. Let worship have its way with you until we are together again. After the service, whether this is your first time with us or you've been here your whole life, you're invited to participate in a virtual Zoom coffee hour where we share a bit of our lives with each other and get to know one another more deeply. Stay for just a few minutes to say hello or stay up to 45 minutes to connect in smaller breakout rooms. If you'd like to learn more about Unity Church and Unitarian Universalism, we invite you to participate in Finding Yourself at Unity today at 1 p.m. This week's 1-hour online class will share information about Unity's social justice and community outreach. Unity's Sustainable Living team is offering a Line 3 pipeline teach-in at 3 p.m. this afternoon. Whether you want more information about the pipeline or you've been following the stories and want to learn of ways to take action, you are invited to this informational session sponsored by Act for the Earth, the new campaign of the Sustainable Living Ministry team. Information about all the offerings shared this morning is available on Unity's homepage. Next Sunday, Reverend Rob Eller-Isaacs and Worship Associate Ben Petty will honor the legacy of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. by renewing our understanding of the practice of satyagraha, a nonviolent resistance, and how its lessons are applicable today. Once again, welcome to Unity Church.
Sometimes, I think the work of adulthood is to look at the stories and the identities we were assigned when we were children. Perhaps those stories about ourselves were told to us by our parents or by our culture, and as children we had little choice but to accept them. But as adults, we can hold these stories up for examination, and like a piece of clothing, we can determine if they still fit us, or if they ever fit us at all. Ideally, we have the power to decide what stories and identities we call our own. But sometimes it might be a lifelong effort to find that power. May our church home be a place where that effort is nourished. Come, let us worship together. And will you join us in singing hymn 318, We Would Be One?
as now we join in singing our hymn of love to pledge ourselves anew to that high cause of greater understanding of who we are and what is this is true. We would be one in living for each other to show to all a new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which binds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves to greater service with love and justice, strive to make us free.
Please join with us in a responsive reading. Hidden in all stories is the one story. The more we listen, the clearer the story becomes.
Our true identity, who we are, why we are here, what sustains us,
is in this story. We invite you to participate in a moment of contemplation and silence.
Each time we gather for worship, we set aside a moment to expand the caring ministry of this congregation. Together we recognize the cycle of life and death, the circle of love, compassion, and witness that is at the center of this and of every sacred community. We stand at the side of parents, teachers, and all those whose primary spiritual practice is caring for children, with those who live with grief or chronic pain, with illnesses seen and unseen, with mental disability or addiction. We pray for our neighbors in prison, for those who care for family members in ill health, and those who are struggling to stay afloat in the midst of poverty. Our lives are blessed by those who knowingly and with curiosity and courage face their final days, and by those who rise above the heartbreak to challenge oppression in all of its forms. We pray for those in harm's way, for the wisdom and strength of the leaders of the world, and for the people of this courageous congregation, as together we live into our longing to embody and help to build the beloved community. Will you pray with me for all these we now name? We celebrate the life and mourn the death of Elizabeth Shippey, a bright, shining light whose light slowly dimmed but never will go completely out. A service for this beloved 100-year-old will be held sometime in the summer. We hold the Griggs family and their extended family and friends as they grieve the death of Chauncey Griggs, who died Thursday. A service for Chauncey will be held here virtually at Unity on January 23rd at 11 a.m. We honor the life of Tim Heaney, who died recently. We hold his beloved wife, Roberta Hunt, and other family members grieving his passing. We also hold the family and friends of those lost during the violence at our nation's capital on Wednesday. We join Carrie Michaels and Lois Harrison in their loving concern for their family members. Carrie's mother and sister have both been diagnosed with COVID. Her mother is currently in the hospital and also suffers from dementia, so it is a particularly challenging time to be in the hospital. Lois's mother is also living with numerous health challenges which require frequent visits to the hospital. We continue to hold Chris Greasy and Vicky Kappas, who are recovering from COVID, but continue to struggle with lingering symptoms nonetheless. We join with members of their family and friends in celebrating with Arlene West and Kevin Beavis 40 years of marriage. When it is your children who ask that this threshold be celebrated, you know you have done something right. Congratulations to Kevin and Arlene. And lastly, we acknowledge the current of grief that flows around the world as lives are compromised or lost to the coronavirus. We are acutely aware of the many ways that community of colors are hit inordinately hard by the pandemic. Each day, both the danger and the grief grow deeper. May we each light a candle of healing, remembering those who have died, and in hope of healing for those that are ill. May the flames we kindle light our way as we make the road by walking it. May we stand in compassionate solidarity with our neighbors here at home and all around the world. May they and may we be instruments of a just and lasting peace. I now invite you to speak aloud or hold in the silent sanctuary of your hearts the names of those you would like to lift today in worship. And let us pray. This morning, the prayer I share with you is a prayer shared with colleagues from our friend and colleague Bill Singford, our minister in Portland, Oregon. We rarely share someone else's prayer, but it struck a deep chord in both of us. Spirit of life, whom we know by many names and no name at all. Spirit of liberation and of love, God of our hopes and of our divided nation, be with us on this day. We know our shortcomings all too well, how the culture of white supremacy is yet to be dismantled, how so many of us still know want and fear. But Spirit, this week has set us back. The forces of hate and falsehood that desecrated the center of our imperfect democracy were successful so easily. We do not know all that we need to know, nor do we know all that we will need to do. But we know this, Great Spirit, that the yearning for liberation still sings in our hearts, that we still have faith that love can be stronger than hate and even fear, that hope can arise out of broken glass and shattered dreams. We are not the first of your people, O Spirit, to struggle, nor the first to find the path forward is stony and rough. We are not the first, nor will we be the last, who must find a way out of what it feels like no way. Be with us, Spirit. Help us stay centered in our vision for beloved community. Help us hold the faith that love can be real. And if we make it, so by the living of our lives. Help us be resolved that the promise of this nation shall not perish, not on our watch, and that the soul of this nation can yet be redeemed. May it be so, and amen.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Good morning, and welcome especially to our children joining in the worship service. As we do, come a little closer to your screen. Come a little closer for this story for all ages. Years and years ago, it was the week after Christmas, and a very young and new hospital chaplain was on call overnight at Bridgeport Hospital in Connecticut. It was about 3:30 in the morning when he was awakened from his sleep and paged to the emergency room where a medical team was responding to a level 1 trauma, the highest level of crises. He got up, he got ready, and he hesitated as he thought about putting on his clerical collar. You see, he had chosen to work as a hospital chaplain, but wearing a collar that would identify him as a chaplain was not a choice. It was an expectation that came with his job. He thought about how wearing this collar and being identified as a chaplain wasn't just for his benefit. It would signal to everybody else in the hospital, everyone around him, something about the inner character of the person wearing the collar. That his very heart and his humanity was available to the people. He was pausing, thinking about that. But he put on his collar and he quickly made his way to the emergency room. But still feeling like that collar left him too exposed and vulnerable and never really sure if he would be fully prepared for what might be expected of him. When he arrived at the emergency room, the room was crowded and busy with doctors and nurses, the medical team trying to resuscitate a 41-year-old woman, trying to do their very best so that at the end of the emergency, the patient wouldn't end up in the morgue. A nurse came by and informed him that the family members had been contacted, but that it would take a few hours because they were flying in from out of state. And so the chaplain stood there, debating whether he should just go and then come back to meet the family when they arrived at the hospital. And as he was debating this, he looked into the emergency room and he caught the eye of one of the nurses. And for just a moment, he could feel the sadness and the fear and the hope and the determination all mixed together in her eyes as she worked frantically. Maybe it was the eyes that kept him standing there, watching in. But quickly, he became uncomfortably aware, like people realize when they show up sort of underdressed for a really fancy dinner party. He became uncomfortably aware that he had nothing to offer. As he stood there, he said, "Everyone has a job to do, but I don't know why I'm standing here. I don't think I have anything to offer. They really don't need me here, do they?" As he thought about this, he realized that the stories of the emergency room were stories of exceptional doctors and nurses, an exceptional medical team of professionals who were trained to be useful and save lives. But what could he offer? No, he wasn't really needed. He didn't belong in this story of the emergency room. And as he thought about just turning and walking away, that nurse who had seen him came out to inform him that the patient had just died. And then she looked at his collar and she thanked the chaplain, saying, "I saw you standing here, and I want you to know that just seeing you standing here reminded me, and I know everyone else in the room, that the patient was a person, was someone's daughter, or maybe someone's parent, was a friend and a neighbor, and reminding the rest of us and me why I had wanted to become an emergency room nurse in the first place." So she thanked the chaplain and went back to clean up the room. The chaplain stepped back and took a deep breath in, stunned by what the nurse had just said to him. She had told him what his place was in the story of the emergency room. In the following months, the chaplain found himself standing and watching to the stories of the emergency room, the stories of people's lives, the stories of fear and sadness, of hope and courage, of life and death. But the chaplain stood in the messy chaos of the emergency room, making sure that in the story there would always be room for the presence of the sacred and the holy. May it be so, and amen.
Your support of the church is an expression of the promises we make to each other and to the world. Though the future is unclear, we can't let fear undermine the strength of the ministry we share. Please do your best to be generous with the church so that the church can, in turn, maintain our staff and programs and keep our promises to the many community partners our Sunday offering support. Today, the larger portion of our offering will be shared with Listening House, a sanctuary from the streets of St. Paul where practical assistance, counsel, and a friendly ear are offered to people who are living without homes, disadvantaged, or lonely. Services are available 7 days a week and include showers, food, laundry, and semi-private rooms for sleeping. This collection will support the purchase of winter clothing and PPP for guests. During the interlude, please visit Unity's homepage to follow the link in the YouTube information section or contribute to the offering. You can also mail in a check or use the Give function in Unity's membership app. Thank you so much for your generosity.
Be thou my vision, O God of my heart, not be all else to me save that thou art. Thou my best thought by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word, I ever with thee, and thou with me, God. Thou my soul shelter, thou my high tower. Raise thou me heavenward, O power of my power. Riches I heed not, nor world's empty praise. Thou my inheritance now and always. Thou and thou only, first in my heart, sovereign of heaven. Sovereign of heaven, my treasure thou art.
Brave space. Together, we will create brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world, to amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect, but it will always be what we wish it to be. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work in it side by side.
Some years ago, I followed the blog of a writer I admired. Her son had died of an accidental opioid overdose, and she wrestled with her grief through writing. After months of reading about her struggle, I became aware of something in her writing that made me uncomfortable and anxious. Time and again, when describing her son and her family, this writer used the word exceptional. Her son was an exceptional musician. Her family was exceptionally close. Her children were exceptionally loving and kind. It was as though she was creating an invisible bulwark between reality and against death with her words, even when evidence proved her wrong. That is, while her son was special to everyone who knew him, he was not an exception to the fact that we all die. And all too commonly, some die young and in tragic circumstances. I don't say that without feeling or without compassion. My own family has experienced the death of someone young and vibrant, but I worried that this writer's insistence on exceptionality worked against her healing, undermining her ability to reckon with what had happened to her son. I've thought about this writer often lately as current events have prompted me to think more about how we identify whose story is ordinary and whose story is exceptional. There's promise and peril in either category, of course, and there are personal, spiritual, and political implications to how we define those identities. We love our heroic pioneers, our superstars. Whether it's Stacey Abrams or Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King Jr., we imbue our exceptional idols with nearly superhuman qualities. And in so doing, we dehumanize them too. We don't permit them the flaws of ordinariness. More dangerously, hero worship might cause us to end up in the passive place of simultaneously asking too much of them and too little of ourselves. If only exceptional people can make change, why should the rest of us bother? And be honest, do they inspire us to be change makers? Or sometimes do we use their perceived heroism to let ourselves off the hook? And further, when we grant exceptional identity to some, do we overlook many other people who make less visible contributions? And do we become prone to ignoring the true complexities of how change happens through coalitions, relationships, and connection? Even more puzzling and bizarre is the danger of thinking about ordinariness as a virtue, and who gets to have an ordinary, non-exceptional identity. Defining a person or a concept as ordinary might on some level seem like an insult, but it's also a power to normalize and center some people, some stories, and not others. Look at how the media and others spoke about small-town, working-class white Americans in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential election, and our national swing to the right. And a seemingly endless number of think pieces and person-on-the-street interviews centered so-called ordinary white Americans as though they had the authority to represent the real America or speak for some imaginary majority. As the writer Rebecca Solnit points out, more Americans work in museums than in the coal industry. But coal miners are treated as iconic Americans, while for museum workers, well, no one is talking about their jobs as a symbol of our national identity. When white identified people are the norm, ordinary, then who is the exception? Why don't we accord an East African immigrant in Minnesota the authority to speak out as an ordinary American, as we do for the corn farmer in Iowa or the coal miner in Wyoming? And frankly, another repercussion of how we assign ordinary, so-called normal identities is that the white people who stormed the Capitol building this week met with little resistance from law enforcement, perhaps in part because they weren't seen as exceptional or outside the norm. They were perceived as familiar, ordinary, unthreatening Americans, despite overwhelming evidence that they were, in fact, violent and dangerous. Here's where I end up landing, naturally. We're all both exceptional and ordinary. But we need to exercise incredible care about how we define those categories when examining ourselves and the lives of others. And I'll even go so far as to say something I know many will object to. We don't need more heroes. Maybe we need role models, but not heroes. We don't need more exceptional leaders to turn into memes, to put on t-shirts, and use as emblems. We need the spiritual maturity to treat all people, including those we admire greatly, as complicated and as flawed. And our world demands that we understand how expanding the circle of what is normal, centered, and yes, even ordinary. We need to understand how expanding that circle allows us to move into greater, more authentic relationships with one another. That gives everyone space to have authorship of their own story, their own identity. And it also enables us to find opportunities to build relationships with people who have identities different than our own. This is possible. This works on every level, from the grieving mother I described earlier, who eventually found healing in the commonalities she shared with other mourning parents. And it works on the level of this church as we build beloved community. And it works toward our ability to heal as a nation. May we love ourselves and one another enough, be brave enough to hold both the exceptional and the ordinary with care. From Democracy by Leonard Cohen. It's coming to America first. the cradle of the best and worst. It's here they got the range and the machinery for change, and it's here they got the spiritual thirst. It's here the family is broken, and it's here the lonely say that the heart has got to open in a fundamental way. Democracy is coming to the USA.
It is a tenet of our faith that every human being has inherent worth and dignity. If you think about this fundamental principle, then you begin to understand, just as KP and Erika have lifted up, that every story has a sacred and holy dimension. Stories shape who we are, what we understand to be true and untrue. They can frame how we view the very reality of our lives. Their power is sometimes beyond the level of daily consciousness, but that does not mean they do not operate in our everyday choices. Stories help us construct an identity as individuals, as community, as a nation, and as a world. They have the power to strengthen or diminish our understanding of our place here. It is in understanding these guiding stories and narratives that can inspire us towards self-reflection and change and transformation. We are the authors of our own stories, and through honest and humble self-reckoning, they can change. Now, I want you to imagine, those of you who are new, think about pictures you may have seen, those of you who actually have a living memory of what this chancel looked like before the fire of 1963. In the front was a traditional dark wood paneled chancel with ornately carved central pulpit, an organ, and a choir loft. Now, I also, as you imagine and remember this dark wood chancel that was very badly lit, I want you to think about the phrase and the metaphor of preaching to the choir. Though it is tempting for every preacher to simply preach to the choir on Sunday and to focus thoughts entirely on our event, the events that unfolded on Wednesday, I'm hoping to put these events in the context of story and narrative. If we literally imagine the physicality of a preacher preaching to the choir in a traditional chancel setting, what this means is that the preacher is actually preaching with their back to the gathered congregation and is preaching up here to the people in the dark. Now, we know and love the choirs at Unity, but only reaching the choir does limit the conversation. We don't preach to the choir because we understand that our faith is forged from connection, the give and take of true dialogue, as exemplified in our relationship among the ministerial staff, the worship team, and the worship associates. That's all forged out of conversation and collaboration. If we did succumb to the enticing invitation, the energizing conversational circuit between preacher and congregation would be lost. Our faith, which is forged from true dialogue, would languish. Even though we are unable to be together in person, we do still, I believe, I have faith that we maintain the circuit of being together. We do so by Zoom, phone, email chats, beautiful handwritten letters, and walks 6 feet apart. This month, the worship theme is authority, and we have seen the effects of someone who rose to power and from the very beginning, his compelling message, which was fueled by fear and objectification of the other, began to create a twisted narrative about who we are and who we should be becoming. He modeled a kind of democracy that began to feel increasingly unrecognizable. In the words of Parker Palmer in Healing the Heart of Democracy, when we forget that politics is about weaving a fabric of compassion and justice on which everyone can depend, the first to suffer are the most vulnerable among us, our children, the elderly, the marginalized, and the disenfranchised. As they suffer, so does the integrity of our democracy. And the integrity of our democracy has been under assault, and it has suffered. I believe those most responsible for the current fragility of our democracy are the sycophants who allowed and encouraged the 4 years of lying to go on and on, who stood by silently or in actual complicity, allowed a national disgrace to slowly unfold. The events of Wednesday were sadly all too predictable. Bless anyone willing to speak truth to power, like Mitt Romney and Alaskan Lisa Murkowski. May more join them in the coming days ahead. Last year, in a service, I offered a benediction that said something like this: a new narrative is being written in this nation. It is a narrative that will include other voices that have not been heard. It will include voices of color, voices from the margins, from the young and the queer, the transgendered, and the voices of immigrants. The need for this shifting narrative was all so clearly evident all over the world after the tragic murder of George Floyd this summer and the uprisings that occurred in response. The calls for a more inclusive narrative have never been more imperative. But this newly forming narrative has threatened the status quo of what we believe about ourselves. This new narrative seeks to include and empower those who traditionally have been disempowered. For you see, we all live within what Isabel Wilkerson calls the master narrative. So there is always the question of who is telling the story, who's in charge of the narrative, and what happens if that narrative begins to change. So you may be wondering, what does Wilkerson mean by the master narrative? I have recently finished reading Wilkerson's book, Caste, which I recommend everyone read. In this book, she argues that the United States has always operated within a narrative of caste, and that our caste system is largely, but not exclusively, based on race. She documents the way this caste system operated and currently operates in every sector of society. She compares this caste system to a superstructure that holds up everything, every structure of society. She calls it the master narrative. She also demonstrates how the system of caste was beginning to shift just a bit. And the backlash that we have witnessed growing the past years is all too predictable. All the system needed was a strangely charismatic leader to fuel the fear that we were, in fact, losing something precious. A way of life we know actually never existed for the majority of American citizens. This narrative of the caste system in the United States is still operative and alive in this country, but it is coming under new levels of scrutiny. We are seeing the struggle writ large every day in the news with people living out these questions. As Erika said, whose story is this really? Which story do you believe and live by? And it is clear we are seeing different narratives and stories fueling decisions and actions. A number of years ago, Unity members Rebecca Flood, Ruth McKenzie, Jane Berg, and I, along with a number of other Unitarian Universalists, traveled to India. The trip was jointly organized by the UU Service Committee and the Holding Program, which seeks to partner and support those who are involved in the work of empowering those most disempowered by the caste system, the Dalits and the Adivasi, who are the indigenous people of India. The Dalits are the lowest rung of the caste system, and the Adivasi are not even included in the caste system, for you see, they are not even viewed as human beings. The parallels to our own caste system here in the U.S. are obvious once you actually stand outside a caste system that you slowly begin to recognize, and then you begin to compare it to our own. The caste system, just like the systems of oppression here, categorize and objectify people, assign characteristics and capacities. The caste system holds the master narrative. Systems of entitlement, privilege, and oppression hold the narrative here. To paraphrase Abram Kendi in How to Be an Anti-Racist, when we categorize groups of people and stop seeing them as individuals, then we are involved in objectification. And this in turn creates a narrative that limits them, and it constricts and limits us. But of course, in this mix is the sacred quality of all of our stories and the paradox that even with these competing narratives and understandings, we are in this all together. We are interconnected. We are individuals with agency, authority, and genuine responsibility. And the task of our democracy is to hold these truths to balance and to nurture our sense of responsibility for one another. This part of the narrative, of our sacred narrative, seems like it has been lost over the past years. Again, in the words of essayist and author Rebecca Solnit, this country has room for everybody who believes that there's room for everybody. For those who don't, well, there's a struggle about whose story it is to tell, and we saw that writ large on Wednesday. This country and its sacred democracy are engaged in a struggle about what we believe to be true about our country. About, are we exceptional, or is our belief in our own exceptional quality is part of what is undermining us at this very moment? What story shall we tell, my dears? What story shall be told about the events on Wednesday? For too long we have imagined that our democracy does make us exceptional, secure, empowering, and that this place is where freedom is available to everyone. What these last years have taught us, if we didn't understand it previously, is that our democracy is incredibly fragile, that it does not value or protect its citizens equally. I believe the sooner we can begin to tell the truths of our history and the many ways we have failed to live up to the ideals of our faith and our democracy, the sooner we can begin to repair what is so badly broken. All of us live by the stories we tell. These stories are shaped by our families and the contexts and environments in which we find ourselves. These stories help us make sense of our lives. And unfortunately, we often tell stories that don't communicate the complex truths and paradoxes inherent in every sacred life. Often we tell stories, as Erika explained, as exceptional or as victims. When we can openly acknowledge the gaps in our own stories and the stories we tell about ourselves, we can begin to better integrate ourselves into the fabric of the larger community. The same is true for this community, and the same is true for our democracy. If we can acknowledge the many ways that we are not a perfect union that upholds justice and liberty for all, then perhaps we can begin to be part of the healing and changing of the national narrative. The least involved sector of the electorate are young voters. But in one state, the increased involvement on young voters was truly remarkable. This particular state saw the largest percentage increase of younger voters of any state in our union. They were engaged and they were energized. Masked, they went door to door. They talked to their friends and they voted. And their friends voted. And the state of Georgia may never be the same. In the words of Parker Palmer, if we can remain clear about the gap between America's aspirations and its reality, our founding myth of equality can continue to energize movements towards its realization. But when we imagine that it actually describes the reality, the myth becomes the enemy of its own aspirations. My dear spiritual companions, it is my hope that this sacred place is a place where we struggle to tell the truth, the humble truth of our own stories, even when the truth breaks our heart as the words escape from our parched lips. May this be a place where we find ways to move together humbly, to tell the sacred truth of the failings of our lives and our democracy, and together find ways to help to heal its wounded and fragile heart. May it be so, and amen.
That is our life, we sing our thanks and praise, for all life is a gift which we are called to use to build the common good and make our own days glad. For needs which others serve, for services we give, for work and its rewards, for hours of rest and love, we come with praise and thanks for all that is our life. For sorrow we must bear, for failures, pain, and loss, for each new thing we learn, for fearful hours that pass, we come with praise and thanks for all that is our life, for all that our thanks and praise, for all life is a gift which we are called to use to build the common good and make our own days glad.
My heart is broken, and I lay it before you and say, come join with me as we gather virtually in our imagination, brokenhearted, praying for our nation, for our communities, for their health. And I close with these words of Paulo Coelho. When we love, we always strive to become better than we are. When we strive to become better than we are, everything around us becomes better too. So may we strive to love even with broken hearts. And may we strive to love even those that we tend to separate and label as other. It is the only way forward. May it be so, and amen.
Straightway beauty on me waits, rain in the morning or sunshine late. When, say the wind, the airs can blow, the sun came up and down fell the snow. The wind blows wet, the sleet falls hard,